I'm John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. I'd like to welcome you to a partnership presentation by Gold Seal Online Ground School and the National Association of Flight Instructors, one that we call The Impossible Turn: Myths, Mistakes, and Misconceptions. Our discussion today will be led by owner and chief instructor of Gold Seal Online Ground School, Russ Still, and NAFI board member, writer, and airline pilot, Brian Schiff. Now, this is a discussion that you probably have heard a lot about over the last few years, and unfortunately, we have found that while some conversations have been really great and informative, some have also sown misconceptions and disinformation. And today, Russ and Brian hope to dispel the myths and disperse some truth that might help you should you find yourself in the unfortunate position to need it. Now, without further ado, Russ, can you start us off?
I sure will. And John, thanks for giving us that lead in. And just because you led the thing in, you're still going to be a part of this. So thanks. And I will say that you and Brian and I have tried to do this for several times. There was always one thing or another that kept putting it off. So I'm really glad that we're finally able to kind of put it together. Brian, we had a lot of false starts, but here you are in Atlanta, and it's fun to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And after having watched so many of your ground school and your training programs, I feel like I'm among a celebrity here.
Oh, please, no.
But definitely a great instructor and one that we can learn a lot from. We have conversations together. I know that we had some phone calls that we thought were going to be 10 minutes about the topic and turned into, how long were we on the phone?
Yeah, at least an hour. We did that numerous times, and after about the third of those, I think we finally decided we're not going to have any trouble at all pulling this broadcast off.
There's plenty to talk about, absolutely.
Yep, there is. So we don't want to necessarily go through and rehash the turn back or the impossible turn, which is, people know is, or some people know I don't like that term, but the turn back, we're not going to go back and talk about the stick and rudder maneuver, the kinetic maneuver itself too much, because that's been done ad infinitum. So why don't we just take the first 5 or 10 minutes and let's kind of catch people up. Let's go real briefly through the maneuver, the whats and the whens and the whys, and then we can take over and talk about the problems that are overlooked so many times by pilots and instructors.
Okay, I think it would be fair to start out by saying that the golden rule has always been for so long that if you lose an engine shortly after takeoff, you go straight ahead. You don't turn around. You can ask anybody who learned to fly years ago, what do you do if you lose an engine after takeoff? And the answer is we go straight ahead. Don't turn back. The problem is, and well, my father had this happen in 1957, and he was trained to go straight ahead, and as soon as his engine failed, he immediately turned back toward the runway.
Yeah, famously.
Famously, and he made it, fortunately, or I wouldn't be here today. And I'd like to probably posture that if he had gone straight ahead, I might not be here today either, because there was really nowhere for him to go except a congested residential neighborhood. And he went back and he was successful, and all the naysayers, the hangar lawyers, the critics, and everybody gave him such a hard time for doing so. It prompted him to start a decades-long study into the topic. Well, I did it and I made it, and if I hadn't, and if I had followed that rule of thumb, that I may not be here today. So he started studying this topic, and he learned there are times when a pilot should turn back, when it would be less hazardous to do so. And that's what we're here to talk about. And finally, he was about to give up on the whole topic until the FAA came around in their advisory circular and posted that, well, flight instructor refresher courses probably ought to start training this maneuver.
Yeah, is that the advisory circular that came out where, yes, instructors are actually expected to start teaching this?
Yes.
But the only thing they really mention is that it's a 180-degree turn back, which is a lot more than that.
Right.
And really no guidance other than that. So that's what we're talking about, right?
Correct. Yeah, it was
Do it, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. Figure it out on your own.
Yeah, it's not 180 degrees. You can't get back to the runway you took off on with a 180-degree turn, unless, of course, you got a good crosswind. So it's more turning than that, but not only that, yes, you have to teach it, but we're not going to give you any guidance as to what to teach or how to do it. So we started putting together digging out of the coffers all of the study material that my dad had on the topic, and we started going over it again in great detail.
Let's, we talk about the 180 degree versus 240, 270, 360. Let's just real quickly go over why we have to be concerned with being able to make a minimum amount of turns. And I think we've got some graphics that we'll be able to use in here to kind of show some of these turn back angles and see what's going on with that.
Sure. To properly fly, if you take off and you're going to turn around and come back to the runway, you can't make a 180-degree turn. You can make a 180 to a parallel runway. But so a lot of people say, oh, just see how much altitude the aircraft loses in a glide when you turn 180 degrees. The FAA refers to 180 degrees. Many CFIs and pundits are out there saying the 180-degree turn back. When I hear 180 degrees, I think of the commercial maneuver, the 180 accuracy approach to landing. That's not what this is. You need to turn many more degrees. You know, it's a 180, then maybe another 90 to get to final and another 90 back, or a 45 and a 45. You could fly a pattern that kind of looks like a question mark.
A question mark, yeah.
How ironic, right?
Yeah.
Like, should we do it? But you need to know how many feet you lose while making a greater turn than 180 degrees, for sure.
That's right. So getting all this stuff figured out in advance is one of the keys. And that's probably one of the misconceptions is people, they think this is a little bit easier than it really is. And they've been told that, well, in my Cessna 172, if I reach such and such an altitude, I can turn back to the runway, and that's that. And that's where people can get themselves in trouble.
Yeah, many pilots have thought that, lost their engine, and attempted the turn back because it's instinctual, and it's more than just turning. And when I first went up and tried the maneuver, I was surprised to learn that it took me several times, and I'm not going to admit to you how many times it took before I actually had the maneuver down pat to go from a VY or slightly slower speed climb at full power to lose the power, lower the nose, and start a 45-degree bank turn. So fly best glide a 45-degree bank turn. That's a lot of pitch change. It's a lot of force dynamics and a lot changing. And it took me a while. It probably took me 5 or 6 times of trying that before I could do it the same way every time and yield the same result. So if you've never done it, I'd like to say that you're probably not going to be able to do it well.
And it's a surprisingly precision maneuver. It's when you, especially if the adrenaline's flowing, once you drop this nose down with zero airspeed and you're trying to go to a precise bank angle and a precise airspeed, it's difficult to do. I mean, we're used to being sloppy and flying plus or minus 5 degrees of bank or 5 knots of airspeed.
We are.
And where I fly.
Yeah.
I guess I am.
Yeah, I aim for better, but that's about what I do
That's
too.
right, but we can get away with that.
Right.
Where those kind of differences can be the difference between not making it.
Correct.
It has to be a precision maneuver. So differentiating the stick and rudder maneuver from other things that we'll be talking about. Let's talk about some of the accident statistics on why, at least common knowledge or common conception is that it's better to go ahead rather than turn back. We know that during the takeoff phase of flight, the takeoff and early departure phase of flight is about where I believe 20 to 25% of fatalities occur, at least in Part 91 flight. Now, not in the airlines and the military so much because they're better trained. But that particular section of the profile is a problem. So we've got some statistics here. We got these from EAA put these together, I believe from NTSB reports. But it kind of gives us an idea on where the amount of flight time is spent and where people have problems.
Yeah, and I think what stands out to me right there are the 2 tall red columns at takeoff and landing.
Sure.
Obviously, that's where we're the busiest. It's where the most changes are happening. And it's the time when, the takeoff time, I think at the airline we call it a critical phase of flight. And so we therefore have a sterile cockpit at that point. But this is a critical phase where you have a high workload, a high dynamic, and then on takeoff, arguably, you're testing your engine at a high power setting for the first time, and a lot can go wrong, and a lot does go wrong there.
Yeah, and I think I said 20 to 25% fatalities. I probably should have said more accurately of accidents occur based on what I'm seeing here. But at any rate, that takeoff period is a real problem area that people have to be ready for. Right. So you think that kind of covers on what the impossible turn is, and now we can get into some of the misconceptions about it? Sure.
The turn is, and I don't like the name impossible turn either. There are times when when it's impossible. If you take off and you lose an engine at 50 feet above the ground, arguably you're not going to turn around. You're going to land straight ahead. If you have a pretty good climb rate, you lose your engine at 3,000 feet, and you're relatively close to the airport, you can turn and fly back toward the airport. There's nothing impossible about that. If you did a really shallow climb and you're too far and too low, of course, you're not. Well, somewhere in between that 50 feet and the 3,000 feet becomes a line where now it's okay, it's possible.
That's right.
So I think that's what we're here to talk about.
Let's take a look at this takeoff profile graphic, and we can kind of expand on that idea and possibly give people a reference on what we're talking about. So the airplane first takes off, and this is the lowest risk area of the flight. This is the point where if you have a problem, you stop. Loss of directional control, noise in the cockpit, smoke. At some point, you're in the air, and as long as there's enough available runway, then you land on remaining runway. And we have it color-coded here because that's the moderate risk area. Now we've entered what is the highest risk portion of the flight. You don't have any runway to land on in front of you. You're too low to have many options and possibly none other than to land straight ahead.
Crash land straight ahead,
Exactly.
the best you can.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the most critical part of possibly the entire flight under VFR conditions. Eventually, the airplane will get to a high enough altitude where other options start to become available. You can turn into a wider pie slice. You can, at some point, you'll have enough altitude, like you were talking about at lunch today, where we can actually turn all the way around us. Now, we may not be able to make it back to the airport, but we're in this area where we have a lot of options. Let's move on to the next picture, which is shows these in a little bit more detail about what we're going to be doing in these four areas of the profile. And there we are. Okay, so once again, the white area, the low risk area. Here, if we have a problem, stop the airplane.
It's low risk, and I might add also on that a lot of pilots are triggered to go. They're armed to go, and if something goes wrong, they just don't abort the takeoff when they should. That's the time to be evaluating your engine, your airplane, anything going wrong, and be prepared to reject the takeoff.
Sure.
If everything's just not perfect, and don't wait, because a little weird noise or vibration at that point might translate into something really bad in the red zone.
Yeah, it's low risk. Take advantage of it. A door pops open.
Right.
Just reject the takeoff, come back around, fix your problem. The moderate area is what we talked about here. This is where you have runway remaining. And then we get into the red area, and the graphic says the impossible turn lives here. Well, this is one time when that term, impossible turn, is 100% accurate. Because if a turn back was available here, it wouldn't be impossible and it wouldn't be in the red area. So this is the area when you cannot make it back. At some point, there's a height that we're going to talk about, and it varies from one airplane to the next in different conditions, but where it might be possible to turn back to the airport depending on a variety of conditions. So
correct, and at that time is not the time to try to figure that out.
Before takeoff.
Yeah, this has to be done on the ground. It has to be practiced ahead of time. And like you said, no two airplanes are going to perform alike. No two pilots are going to perform alike. Every takeoff at every airport and in the weather condition and pilot an airplane, every takeoff has its own fingerprint. And that needs to be evaluated before takeoff, and the decision needs to be made. I've heard some instructors give the advice that plan on the engine failing after takeoff and be ready for it. And when it doesn't, it didn't happen. I guess
Yay.
I'll continue on. Yeah, yay. And otherwise, when it happens, you go, oh, there it is. I'm ready for it. Here's what I'm going to do. And that decision height, that altitude we're talking about is something that we've discussed before, that I've discussed before, and pilots can figure out what that is.
Yeah, and even things like being aware of what if there's a crosswind on the takeoff, being aware of which side it's coming from. If you don't think of that during a normal takeoff and you suddenly lose an engine at 800, 900, 1,000 feet, now you've probably forgotten where the wind was coming from. But I always say to myself, I have a problem, on a turn left, or I'm going to turn right. I'm going to turn into the wind. So that's something I do on the ground, because if I don't do that before I take off, if I get the winds wrong and I do want to do a turn back, there's a 50-50 chance that I'm not going to make it.
Right.
Because if we turn downwind with the wind, we get blown away from the airport, as you know.
Yeah, the turn should be into the wind, and a pilot should be aware of that ahead of time. And the pilots who get into their airplane, like you and I get into our cars, are the ones that are unprepared. And when something happens, it turns catastrophic. If you're having a little bit of yellow stripe down your back and you have a little bit of fear, there's nothing wrong with that. An appropriate level of fear makes you keep asking, okay, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? Okay, here, it's planned beforehand. I know the wind is from the left, so if I have an engine failure after takeoff, terrain permitting, I'm going to turn to the left. I might let that wind drift me to the right a little bit, and then if I lose the engine, I'll turn back in. There's nothing wrong with being paranoid about it happening, planning for it, and then if it doesn't happen, oh well, all your plans can just, go out the window.
Yeah, so planning beforehand is key. Another big one is having practiced or having been trained properly to do this before attempting it. We hear lots of, well, maybe perhaps they're anecdotal, but stories about pilots who attempted this with no training. They had just heard about it and they tried it, and sometimes that didn't work out so well. So training is pretty important.
It's very important. Training, practice, and on that note, not just anybody can train you. Just because you get I think you said this at lunch as well, that if you get your CFI certificate, I wish I knew half as much now as I thought I knew when I first handed my CFI. I thought I knew everything at that point. But no, you're not qualified to teach this right away unless you've been through some kind of training and practice or developed a system for this. And I'm by no means saying that my way is the best or that your way is the best. Every instructor can come up with, there's probably a better way to do it than what I've been talking about. And I think honing in on the best practice would be a good idea for the industry to do and have some guidance rather than just saying you need to teach this with no guidance. So practice is very important, and like I said, for as many times as it took me to get the maneuver down pat, and I'm an active flight instructor, active pilot, I fly all the time, I was very surprised at what it took, and so practice is crucial.
It's not as easy as you think it is to do it
No.
precise. If you want to nail those bank angles and nail the airspeed, not as easy as you think.
Yeah, and it's not as important to nail it. Nailing it is good. You want to be as precise. You want to be cool hand Luke when you're flying it, and you can be if you practice it ahead of time. I was surprised at the pitch forces, the amount of pitch I had to change to go from a VY to VX climb down to a glide. It's a lot of pitch change. It's a lot of dynamics changing as your airspeed is coming back and while you're turning, and it takes practice and the muscle memory to get it there. How many times does it take us to get a landing down pat? This maneuver is kind of like landing.
Yeah.
You got to practice it, and then when you get it, you get it.
In my 182, when you first pitch down and you bank over into that bank, that spiral, the airspeed starts coming up quickly, so you have to kind of raise the nose to arrest that acceleration. And in my airplane, boom, the stall horn's screaming like crazy right about then. So again, it's a precision maneuver that takes a lot of practice. The one thing that I hear so much about, and I'm sure you do too, is this height, this decision height is what I call it, but an altitude in which it can be safely made. EAA, in that webinar that they did, put together a graphic where they asked people, they had an app on their phones where they could vote,
Right.
and they had different altitudes. When do you think you can make this turn back to the airport?
I remember
Can you do
that.
it at 400 feet? Well, here it is, 400, 800, and this is kind of interesting. What do you have to comment on this?
Well, when I first look at that, I think, I fly a myriad of airplanes, and I don't know which one am I flying at the time, and it varies for the airplane that I'm flying. A 172, I would go with the common answer there, because around 750 feet is the target for me, and I've explained in other classes where I've come up with that. Yeah, but there should be it depends.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so it depends, and you can't just say at any airplane that I fly or any airport out of which I'm flying in any wind conditions or terrain that I'm going to do it between 800 and 1,000 feet. You just can't have a blanket rule like that. Every takeoff is different.
Yeah, so when your buddy tells you that if you're in a 172 and you're at 850 feet, you can do this, it's probably bad advice.
I would think so, yeah, because it's not always going to be the case.
Yeah, a big thing that has always kind of bothered me about, and I would say none of the above if I was voting on this, it depends on factors such as your climb angle. You and I are both big fans of it's all about the angles, as you've said.
Right.
Let's take a look at how climb angle versus your glide ratio, your gliding angle coming back, makes a difference on whether or not you can make it back to the runway, because it's not just altitude, it's also all about the angles.
Correct.
So we've got okay, we're going to have a little video here where we're going to watch it and see it, but let's talk about the angles. So when you depart,
well, basically you've got a climb angle and you've got a glide angle. And if you can climb at a steeper angle than you can glide, odds are you can make it back, depending on the wind. conditions at the time. So if you have a strong wind, you're not going to want to do this anyway. Two things would be big red flags for me: a strong headwind and a short runway are two things that would really caution me against doing this, because they have their own risk factors. So if you can climb steeper than you can glide, basically you can do it.
Climb steeper than you can glide. You absolutely have to stay above that return glide angle on your departure out. And you have to allow enough room too to do this turn the kinetic maneuver, the stick and rudder maneuver, to get turned back inbound. You're going to lose a lot of altitude in that. When you finish that, you still have to be above or on that glide ratio coming back in.
Correct. And I flew this at one point to see those two angles. I flew it in a 172 and utilized a Stratus and ForeFlight and captured the data of my flight. This was in a 172, and I was flying with about a 3 to 5 knot headwind. And this picture actually describes how I calculate the target altitude. I just do a gliding 360-degree turn, and how much altitude do you lose there? And the reason 360 degrees is because of what we discussed earlier. Somewhere between 270 and 360 is the amount of turn it's going to take to get back to the runway. If I was going to be wrong on that, I'd rather be wrong toward the 360 side. So in a 172, it's about 450 feet after you've perfected the maneuver.
Yeah.
Mind you, I've done this. The first time I did it, I lost 700 feet. The next time I might have lost 600 feet, then maybe 500, then 500 again. And I got it down pat and I lost 450. So if I call it 500 in a 360-degree turn, then I add a 50% fudge factor to that. That's for density, altitude, for a different weight of the airplane, for different winds, for all of the things that the naysayers write in about and say, well, you didn't account for this or you didn't account for that. I add 50% to that. So a 500-foot altitude loss in a 360, I add 50%, and I come up with 750 feet. And that's me with my technique. If you do it and practice it and you find that you can't do it without losing less than 600 feet, well, then add 300 and make it 900 feet your altitude. Add whatever fudge factor you want. You can double it. Just have a point where the decision is made.
Yeah.
But back to that flight that I was telling you about, I tracked everything that I did.
Yeah, we've got, you can see, I've seen the graphic, you can see where you took off, you can see the angle,
Yeah.
you can see the angle when you came back and compare the two.
Right, and I just looked at the data in ForeFlight, just opened as a KML file, looked in ForeFlight, and you could, in Google Earth, and you can click on the profile, you can click, right click on your track and click on the menu, you'll see View Vertical Profile. Yeah, that's it.
There we are.
So you look at the vertical profile, and you can see that my climb angle, just by looking at it, is steeper than the glide angle. Now this was taking off toward the west with about a 3 to 5 knot headwind to right down the runway. So that's about what yielded this. And as I climbed out, I 750 feet, pulled the power back, made the turn back, lined up with the runway, and touched down. You can see where I lifted off and where I touched down, and they're pretty close. But I did touch down earlier, so that also tells you why a short runway is going to be more difficult, because there's little room for error, and usually you can't get back to the point where you actually lifted off from.
Yeah, I like this graph because I've been looking for a way to try to describe this to people, and I could never quite put it together, but having seen this, now I know how to describe it. The blue line, the upper line, is your climb angle. It's clearly a steeper angle than your return angle is. So that whole time, you can make it back to the airport. Had you ever gotten below that return glide ratio, though, the radius, the angle, you couldn't have made it back. So it's all about the angles.
Right, and that was a 45-degree turn. That was with a headwind right down the runway at about 5 knots, and it was flown at the best glide speed for a 172. I will also note that on this picture, you can see there's nothing but fields around the airport. And I'm going to say with emphasis that if you're flying out of this airport and you lose an engine, this is not the airport where you're going to do a turn back. I'd utilize one of these beautiful fields out here and not even attempt to turn back to the runway.
Yeah, I get you. This idea, though, that there's a certain magical altitude that says you can or cannot make it back. Let's just say that it's you have determined that in your Cessna 172 you can make the turn back at 800 feet, but you climb out at a very shallow climb angle. It doesn't matter, and by the time you get to that 800 feet, it doesn't matter because you're just too far from the airport.
Right.
You are then below the return glide angle.
Correct, correct, and that's why My father has come up with a rule of thumb that you need to cross over the departure end of the runway at least 2/3 of the altitude that your turnback altitude or your observed altitude loss altitude minus the fudge factor.
Yeah, that confirms that you're on a steep enough climb angle.
Exactly. So if you cross over the end of the runway at 1 foot, and then a mile later you're at 2 feet, and then a mile later you're at 3 feet, well, now you're 3 miles from the runway at 3 feet high. That is an exaggeration, but that shows you that your climb angle is too shallow to make it back.
Yeah.
Or the runway is too short to make it back.
So whenever we talk about a decision height or a turnback altitude, we really need to keep in mind of what was the climb gradient that got you there.
Correct. You can't just take off. If you're at one of these airports where there's nowhere to go, nothing but a very congested residential area or rough terrain, and your only surviving move is to get back to the runway, then that needs to be pre-planned. You need to know ahead of time, okay, this is my altitude. I'm going to turn this direction. And I'm going to climb so as to put everything in my favor,
Sure.
climbing at a speed somewhere between Vx and Vy. You're not going to do a high-speed cruise climb right after liftoff in that scenario.
Gotcha. There was a Mooney that departed the Rio Linda Airport out in California, and this was probably 10 or 12 years ago, and we've got some video from this. It was taken at, the video was shot from a security cam at a high school. This guy had done, I believe it was an engine rebuild, and this was a return to service flight. It was him and his mechanic in the airplane. So let's see if we can get this video up here. It's black and white, and let's just take a look at how it went. So he departed runway 35, and there he is in the white circle. Now he's climbing up through about 200 to 300 feet. You can see him turn. That's where he had his failure. Now he realizes he's too low. He's not going to make it. He pulls back, accelerated stall. There's about a turn and a half or a 3/4 turn into a spin. And unfortunately, 2 fatalities resulted from this. Now, it happens pretty quick in the video, so we made a 3D animation of this so we can kind of see it a little better. And we're going to dovetail into what you were just talking about, options off the end of the runway. So let's take a look at this same thing in 3D. So here's the Mooney departing runway 35. There's his engine failure. He turns back, cranks back too much, trying to stretch the glide, which is a physical impossibility. And then, unfortunately, that was the end of him. So this is what it looked like. But let's take an overhead look using Google Earth and see what some of his other options were. He had a lot of choices here. So runway 35 is over on that side of the screen. Yeah, so it's going this way, goes past a green area with some kind of racetrack in it or some kind of track facility. Then farmlands. He even had a 2-lane highway going left and right. A 90-degree turn would have certainly done it. So look at all these options he had. Yet he instinctively made this decision to turn back to the airport at about 300 feet with a dead engine. And you could see what the result was, and that's what would be expected. So this is exactly what you were talking about with yours. Look at all the options around.
Yeah, and that's why in this situation, you shouldn't go back to the airport. You shouldn't attempt to turn back, and especially from 200 feet. If you know that your altitude, and in a Mooney, say it's 900 feet, I'm making that up, 900 feet is my altitude, I am not going to go back for the runway. I've practiced this, and I know that above that altitude, my skills have been honed enough to do that. But I also know that below 900 feet, I can't do it.
It is the impossible turn.
It is the impossible turn at that point, and his instinct, or her, I don't know who the pilot was to turn back at that point. And I would guess at 200 feet, the airplane was probably right around here. And so I agree with you. There were options, but even if there are no options, turning back wasn't one of them.
No,
and that should have been determined before takeoff.
Yeah, the decision height, the turn back altitude is not a single point in space. It's an altitude, but it's also a horizontal position. And this is where your window to turn back or do some other solution opens.
Yes, it does. And it closes as you get further away from the airport. I mean, let's say you're cruising at 3,500 feet.
Well, I don't know if you want to climb it very steep up to 20,000 feet, you could still climb back. It's all about the angles.
You do that in your 182. I don't think my Citabria can do it. But then you get 50 miles from the airport. Well, now the airport obviously at that point is not an option. So we're talking about a window of opportunity that you just need to be aware of before you take off.
Okay, I've got some Facebook comments that came about as a result of us announcing this. But before we get to this, I want to continue on a little bit about this idea about runway geometry. There was another famous, it was a Mooney crash. Well, it wasn't a crash, the guy was successful, but it was a Mooney turnback.
Oh,
I believe it was in Illinois or Indiana. It was in the wintertime.
it was snowy on the
It's
ground.
snowy on the
kind of
ground, yeah. We've got the video, but we don't have it queued up for this presentation.
I remember
But what
that
we
one.
do have is we've got, we'll just show the airport diagram and talk about what happened. That'll be good enough. So he departed his Mooney, I think it was a 20C, I'm not sure, and departing to the south. So yeah, he departed on runway 18 to the south. He had an engine failure off the end of the runway. And it was not a complete failure. He was still getting some kind of thrust, but he probably had a busted cylinder or something similar to what happened to me. He made the decision to turn to the right, back to the airport. He managed to crisscross across. I mean, he had no trouble getting back to the runway. It was almost like he had too much altitude and speed. He managed to get it stopped, and that was great. Didn't hurt his airplane other than the engine damage. But you know, did he make the right choice on this turn?
I hate to Monday morning quarterback another pilot because
Sure.
I wasn't there and I wasn't in his shoes, but that caveat given, I look at this and I think, boy, there's a perfectly good long runway right here, and if he'd have turned to the left, exactly like you're showing there, that looks like a better plan to me. And if you give that a little bit of forethought, I think you have that in your head already.
And this kind of takes me back to this concept of before takeoff briefing.
Correct. Very
You could
important.
have easily briefed this. We've got another image just of this same idea of an airplane taking off on a runway with another option off to the side. So I talk a lot about runway geometry, and it has to do with both are other runways available for you to turn back onto, and also the length of the runway itself. So this is similar to the gentleman in the Mooney departing if he comes back, if he has an engine failure, has to get back for any reason, he doesn't have to turn very far to get back on 14.
Yes, less turning is involved to get back to runway 14 than 18. And also if you have a parallel runway over here. Now it's a 180.
Sure.
It's just made depending on how far apart
Yeah, it's
the
like a turn to
runways are.
downwind.
But on the runway, it doesn't have to be a runway. It can be just an open field. It could be the ground between the runway and the taxiway.
Exactly.
It could be the taxiway.
Yeah, Rod Machado discusses, I mean, really pushes that a lot when this topic comes up, that you don't have to make it back to the runway. You just need to get back to, an
Right.
airport tends to have a lot of clear areas. So
Right.
if you could just get back to the airport property, you're probably gonna survive.
Yeah, and not only that, but if you do crash land on the airport property, you're more likely to have some emergency equipment nearby. It's going to be easier to access the crash site. So if you are injured, you're going to get help sooner.
Okay, so runway geometry has to do with the availability of other landing areas and other runways. We actually were out doing some videoing about this turnback maneuver. This was about 3 years ago. Ethan, our broadcast director here, was with me. So we were rolling cameras, and we went ahead and at the Cherokee County Airport, which is just north of Atlanta, about 30 miles. So let's take a look at this video and show a simulated one turned back. I tend to use a 30-degree bank angle. That's what I used in this one. There's a lot of valid argument that 45 may be better. So anyway, the runway was 5,000 feet, no obstructions. It was a nice cool day. I was in a Cessna 182, crosswind, 6 knots from the right. So I had already briefed myself that if I have a failure, and I know I'm going to because it's simulated, I'm going to turn to the right. That's one less thing that I have to spend time and brain CPUs deciding. So I have forgotten what the ground level here is. I believe we went up to 750 or 800 feet AGL. Now you can see down below this particular airport, especially when it comes back, that there's no good landing options
It's not
here.
flat.
Oh yeah, there's deep ravines, it's all rocks and trees, and over here on the sides, a lot of very high, high tension power lines. So we ought to be coming up to our altitude. When we get to it, we're gonna kill the engine. We're gonna simulate this startle period of about 4 seconds, and then roll into 30-degree bank. Okay, there's our engine failure, countdown. Now the pilot reacts, rolls into 30 degrees, and tries to keep the best glide speed. And let's see how she works. Look at those power lines down there. You're right on top of them. Okay, so ForeFlight gives us another little view of this thing. All right, so we're turned back in on the airport. the runway from when the runway from whence we departed. Here's a good view of all these. If you come in low here and you don't make it, you're just going into an embankment off the end of the runway. You're going on the fantail of an aircraft carrier. Look at all the rocks down there. So ugly stuff. All right, the PAPI shows we're high, so that's good. Runway is assured, flaps come down, and we're going to get this one down. We're going to use this as an example to talk about runway length and how that has an effect. Okay, we're back on the runway that we departed from. We touch pavement, and boom. Okay, now I want you to look at this taxiway off to the left. This is kind of a reference point. We're going to now go into the 3D world and look at this airplane in this position. So that's how much runway we actually, in this example, we were a little high. We had some extra airspeed because I had to put in flaps. But let's just say that that's as far as we made it on our turn back practice.
Okay.
So what would have happened if the runway was shorter?
Well, you lifted off way back at that part of the runway, I presume.
That's right. If the runway was shorter,
this is where you'd touch down, right?
Wouldn't
here.
have made it. We made it on a 5,000-foot runway, but had we done that same departure from a 3,000-foot runway, we would not have made it. And that's why I continue to push on this idea that runway geometry and runway length is a critical factor. Now, looking back at your flight that we had up there, it was interesting to see that you could come back almost to the point that you departed from, almost to the end of the runway where you took off from. But
right, and it was very it was risky for me to try to land that far down the runway. Now, granted, I had a really long displaced threshold on the other side, which is it's not even displaced threshold. It's an unusable portion of the runway.
What is this, about a 4,000-foot runway?
It's about 7,000 or 8,000.
Oh, wow.
6 or 7,000.
Oh, wow, okay.
There. But there's an unusable portion on each end of the runway, and I knew and calculated the latest I could touch down with my landing distance available, and you can see the 1,000-foot marker there, and I touched down with about 2,000 feet remaining.
Excellent.
Yeah, and
so if this had been a 2,000-foot runway, you would have been cutting it very close.
It would have been right on, and if it was anything shorter than that, I wouldn't have made it, and I would have had to take different kind of precautions or not fly out of there.
Yeah. Now we could say that there's not many 2,000-foot runways around, at least not that people commonly use. And you could argue that, well, if that was a 3,500-foot runway, you would have still made it. But that was because you were practiced, you did it perfectly, you were ready for it, you had done everything properly. Somebody who doesn't have all the odds in their favor, still at 3,500 feet just might not make it back to the runway.
Right, it's very true. And you can see here clearly by trying this, and you can try it at altitude, but the problem is it's a different density altitude. You're gonna have different true airspeeds if you try it up high to get this kind of image for your airplane. And also the winds may be stronger than they may be. And if you have a strong wind, that's when I'm advocating you don't want to do it. Because if you take off into a strong headwind, and I think we were talking about this as well, the energy that you're gonna have to dissipate in the crash is gonna be much greater. So if I have a 30-knot headwind, for example, and I'm taking off and climbing at 65 knots, what does that do?
Slows you down a lot.
Slows you down. So you half your airspeed, that quadruples your energy. Or 1/4 the energy needs to be dissipated.
Yeah.
But if you turn around and you go from 60 to 90 knots, now you've got much more energy to dissipate in the crash, and it quadruples the amount of energy that needs to be dissipated. If you just double your airspeed, you quadruple the airspeed, the energy needed to be lost, and that's a lot to absorb in a crash. So if you're bottom line, would you rather crash an airplane at 30 knots into the wind, or would you rather crash an airplane at 90 knots?
Exactly.
Of ground speed.
Crashing into the wind is crucial.
Right, and also with a strong headwind, and you make a turn back, now you've got a strong tailwind. I'd posit that you may likely overshoot the runway.
Yeah, you end up with the same problem on the other end of the runway.
With all that energy.
Yeah. So with a heavy headwind, a turn back is probably another reason not to do the turn back.
Correct.
Strong headwind.
Correct. Short runway,
Okay.
strong headwind.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if we can bring John in here and see if he's got something to join us with. He may have some comments or two, or three. Hey, John.
Guys, so far this discussion has been really interesting. I really like the fact that we're not talking in absolutes, because we know that the world operates in gray, right? So the idea that no takeoff is the same, frankly, not even takeoffs on the same day are the same. And that's something that I never really thought of before. And I think a lot of our viewers might not have either. Now, I know you mentioned the concept of, okay, the more information you can sort of brief and understand on the ground, the better. But do you advocate sort of putting that into your verbal pre-takeoff brief? And if so, how would you integrate that? What things would you actually say out loud?
Barry?
Well, I would.
Did it.
I answer to both.
Ryan.
I would brief myself. You need to consider. Okay, first of all, is this an airport that has options off the end of the runway? So A or B. This is a binary. Am I going to go in a field? Do I have options, or is it an airport like we just saw you demonstrate, where there's nothing but rough terrain? Catalina's one. I've also got several airports in Southern California that are nothing but very congested residential areas and school playgrounds are the only fields that you've got with children's playing in them, and the only streets are bumper to bumper traffic.
Hmm.
If it's one of those airports, then you're going to want to do some planning. You got to know ahead of time. First of all, so I've practiced my maneuver. I know what my altitude is. Which direction is the wind coming from? What is my field elevation? If my altitude is 800 feet, then, or my observed altitude loss, or the amount of altitude it takes to get back down, I need to add my field elevation to that, so I have a number on my altimeter. So if you're at 1,000-foot field elevation and it takes you 800 feet to do a turnback, then 1,800 feet on your altimeter, and pre-briefing that ahead of time. So I want to do 18. If we lose our engine below 1,800 feet, we're going to land straight ahead or slight turns, whatever looks best, and we're going to crash land the best we can, as slow as we can. And I think one of my favorite famous pilots said once that if you touch down with your wings, if you crash land with your wings level and as slow an airspeed as possible under control, you're going to survive the accident. And so you crash the best you can. If you're above that altitude, we're going to turn back. Which direction? Terrain could affect that. If I have terrain off to one side, I'm going to turn the other way. If I have wind coming from one side, I'm going to turn into the wind. And we're going to brief that ahead of time. That all becomes part of the briefing, and you're ready to do it. Any more?
Yeah, the briefing ahead of time is the big part to me from what you just said. Once again, brief these things every time you take off. We do a run-up in the run-up area. You've got a checklist you do. Why not add just a little bit more right before you cross that whole short line? In the event of a problem, which way am I going to turn? What are my options? That kind of thing.
Right, and I can just hear some of the viewers thinking to themselves, I'm flying by myself. Why am I briefing this out loud? Well, briefing it out loud is actually a very good technique because it solidifies it in your own mind. It's going to give yourself the technique, the state of mind, and you actually have an inner co-pilot, and that's who you're talking to. And I think briefing it out loud to yourself solidifies that for sure.
Yeah, makes it real. Okay, thanks, John. We've got a couple of other things we want to get covered, and I know we're moving along here time-wise. One thing I want to make sure we come back to at the end of going through some of these is this issue about why are some bank angles better than others for the turnaround. But at any rate, one gentleman, this is in one of the CFI groups on Facebook when we first announced this. He said, the impossible turn, what's the point? My question is, why let this stick inside somebody's head? There are so many possible things to talk about that are real. This kind of reminded me of back when the FAA was not really on board with this. It's not something you're supposed to talk about. It's a controversial issue. Don't even address it to students. So this kind of sounded like that to me, like it's best one of those things. It's a stone we don't turn over.
To me, it sounds like putting your head in the sand.
Exactly.
You know, it's something that is rare, an engine failure on takeoff, but they happen. They're happening a lot. That's probably the most likely time for an engine to fail. And there are certain emergencies for which we don't have time to think about our plan when they happen. If you're in cruise flight and you see your alternator start going a little bit left, you have time to get the book out, read the procedure, take your time and figure out what your plan of action is. Many emergencies, just you have plenty of time. There's no need to hurry. This is one that needs to be premeditated.
Exactly.
That's why we're talking about it. It's something that we just saw a video of someone who didn't think about it ahead of time and probably never talked about it because he thought it was impossible. But his engine failed. and he instinctually went back to where he thought was a safe place, getting back to that runway. That's where I came from. That's where I want to go back to. And that's an instinct that many humans can't overcome. And the only way to really do it is to plan ahead, to talk about it, to brief yourself ahead of time.
Yep, plan for it, train for it, and then brief it.
Yeah.
Okay, next person said, I think the question was, should you do this and when should you do this impossible turn? He says, depends on the aircraft, loading situation, and many other factors. Impossible? No. I've demoed it many times in powered aircraft. If it's impossible, then how could I do it? Okay, let's just stop right there. If it's impossible, how could I do it? We see a lot of videos out there, on YouTube especially, that say, okay, if this is the impossible turn, look at me, I just did it. Well, it's not always impossible. It depends where you are in that flight profile, in that departure profile.
Correct. And I think that's why you and I both don't like that term, the impossible turn. And maybe it's not even, we shouldn't even say turn back, basically. Sometimes I just say, look, you have enough altitude to turn and fly back to the airport. So you're flying the airplane back to the airport. That's what it is. It happens to be a maneuver that needs some practice because the skills involved are not something that we practice all the time.
Yep. Okay, I think John's got something more he wants to add to the conversation. John?
Hey guys, thanks. I am monitoring our social streams. We've got a couple questions on here. One of them really came from Tom, and he asked, have you tried this in a complex airplane? What kind of considerations would you have to try a turnback in a complex or retractable gear airplane?
That's an outstanding question.
Exactly, because now we know where we're going with this.
Right, and we've been talking about a 172 or simple airplane, not complex airplane. But some considerations with a complex airplane are going to be, well, you have a landing gear, retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. So those are the considerations. I would leave my gear up until such time as I absolutely knew I could make the runway. I think in that Mooney, we actually saw him put the gear down pretty early. And he landed pretty long anyway in that video you were referring to.
Yeah, the one in Illinois or Indiana, the snow. Yeah, he put his gear down about halfway through the turn, but he probably needed it for the drag because he was already overflying the airport.
Correct. So I would say consider putting the gear down only at the very end when you know you've got the runway made. And if you think it's questionable, don't put the gear down. You're going to wind up landing shorter anyway. Don't worry about ruining the airplane. People with complex airplanes, I think, are more worried about their airplanes and their engines and their gear. And at this point, insurance company owns the airplane. Do what you've got to do to survive. That's what this is about. So don't put the gear down until you have to. As far as the propeller goes, if you have the wherewithal and if you've seen this done, pull the propeller back to a low RPM, high pitch setting. It's almost like feathering it in a multi-engine airplane. It drastically reduces the drag, and that's something that you can use to stretch out your glide some more. And in fact, if you're going to overshoot the runway, come in high, push it back in. If your engine is still working and you still have oil pressure and you can control that, of course. And then lastly would be the flaps. The flaps are obviously going to, like the gear, going to wait till the end. You're going to put the flaps down when you need them down. Another technique is to put half flaps down. And if you find you're going to undershoot, put them back up. If you find you're going to overshoot, put them down and use your flaps like you would a throttle if you had power.
Let me go back to one of these, so make sure we get these done. All these things are running through my head, and I want to make sure I get them all covered. Okay, so we discussed that everybody's doing YouTube videos saying it's not the impossible turn because I just did it. Well, that depends. Let's see. We have demonstrated this in a Cessna 172 many times, documented various bank angles, and determined that it's quicker at a 60-degree bank to get back. Also, and that's something worth discussing.
It is.
Also, as already mentioned, stall speed is based on load factor. Yep. In a descent, let the plane come down. Load factor stays near 1. Well, it's only going to stay near 1 if you're accelerating through the spiral. But let's go back to the 60-degree bank angle thing.
Sure.
And let's work from there back 40, 45, 30, back to a standard rate turn.
Okay. So a 60-degree bank angle will, in fact, get you around, and you'll spend a lot less time in the turn and lose less altitude, as a matter of fact. But I don't like the increase in stall speed provided by a 60-degree bank turn. It's almost, I think a 75-degree bank turn will double your stall speed. 60 degrees will be almost that. So I think it's going to increase it by 75%. If we back it up to a 45-degree bank Now we're kind of splitting the lift and the turning of the wing 50-50, and it increases the stall speed by about 19%. So if you have a stall speed of 55, it's going to make it 65, or if you have a stall speed of 45, it's going to be even less than that. Backing it up to a 30-degree bank, which you said you prefer, is probably safer because you're really not going to affect the stall speed much at all, but you're going to take a wider radius. There's no right and wrong here, but that wider radius will leave you farther from the airport. And I would say if you got a strong crosswind, maybe that's okay. It's going to probably help you. So there may be a time and place to do that. And then standard rate, I think that's just way too gentle. That's going to take you way too far from the airport.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that a standard rate turn under these normal, if they are normal, such things, for a turn back or a possible turn maneuver, standard rate turn, you're never going to make it back to the airport because you're going to spend all your time descending half-mile off the end of the runway. And in fact, we were up doing some filming up at an airport up in the mountains on the border of Georgia and North Carolina. This was last year, and there was a gentleman out there, and I could tell he was going out there practicing the turn back. I think he had a Piper Colt or a Tri-Pacer or something like that.
Yeah.
And I watched him, and he would go climb out, and he would immediately take a little turn off to about 20, 30 degrees off to the right, which that's okay. And then I would see him simulate the engine failure, but he would bank in such a shallow fashion that he just made this big arcing turn around the airport property and then he was still a mile from the airport when he had to give up and put the power in. And I watched him do it again. And wasn't going to be confrontational or anything, but I asked him on the radio, hey, what bank angle? I see you doing practicing your turn back. What bank angle you were using? And he said, well, whatever it takes. So that kind of thought process, whatever it takes, is not all that good. I personally would say between 60, 45, 30, and a standard rate, which is what, about 22 degrees or something. I would rule out 60 degrees and 22 degrees as not good choices.
Well, if you're at best glide speed, you know, I know that from teaching instrument students, that's the only time I do standard rate turn. And even in the pattern, I think most pilots will do a 30-degree bank, which is twice a standard rate. And a standard rate is a function of your true airspeed. So if you're at best glide speed and your true airspeed is down that low, the bank angle is going to be pretty shallow, probably less than 15 degrees, maybe closer to 10. And I think that if you're trying to get back to the runway, that's just not going to do it. But also, I think other pilots have probably heard critics say that you should not ever do this down low to the ground, this kind of maneuvering down low to the ground. Well, have you ever flown a short approach? That's the maneuvering we're talking about, except for the pitching from high pitch to from climb to glide, that transition. That should be practiced at altitude. Then, with an instructor, a qualified instructor, I think you should go out to the airport and be part of the dawn patrol at a towered airport. If you have a towered airport, do it early in the morning. No one's there. They're happy to help you. And when I did it, I must have went up to the turn back one direction, then I went to the west and did the turn back that way, and I was just going back and forth. The runway was mine. And interestingly, with a 5-knot headwind to the west, I noticed a significant difference in the ability of the airplane when I did with a 5-knot tailwind coming back the other way. 5-knot tailwind on takeoff into a headwind on the turn back.
Gotcha.
Which would be abnormal, because normally you take off into a headwind. But that's when to do it. And down low, I think maybe he was, not wanting to turn too steep because he's down near the ground.
Yeah. I had this discussion with a friend of mine. He's an instructor. He's in Idaho, and he was just vehemently opposed to actually doing this low to the ground or at an airport. And I understand where he's coming from, but it's one of those things that I had to respectfully disagree with, because I do teach this maneuver a lot to CFIs, and we do it at the airport. There is some increased degree of risk about maneuvering close to the ground.
There is, and we maneuver.
It's the only way you can learn it.
We maneuver close to the ground every time we land an airplane.
Yeah.
And fly in the pattern. It's something that we do, or if we shoot a short approach. But when you're going to do something different than you normally do with a 45-degree bank, arguably you're not supposed to use a 45-degree bank in the pattern. I think there's something in the regs on that. But I would do that at altitude first until I became comfortable at transitioning from a level climb to a gliding 45-degree bank turn. That transition is a skill that needs some honing, and I was humbled by how many times it took me. Now, your mileage may differ. You may be able to do it in 1 or 2 tries, but it took me several tries to get that down pat.
Yeah. Well, I think we're probably running out of our allotted time here. We've had a good time going over, trying to focus on the myths and misconceptions. It's just so many times these things are ignored. So keep them in the conversation. If you have some more comments about this, please leave it in the comment area there, and we'll try to address them afterwards. So Barry, thanks for
Barry?
you know, this
Is
is we
Dad
talked
here?
about this. I wanted him to write Brian on his forearm right here so I could read it. Brian, thanks for coming out here from Texas, from
Absolutely.
Dallas. We'll be doing some more of this. It's been a lot of fun, especially since we've spent 6 months trying to put this together.
It's been a while, but we've had a lot of great conversations in the meantime, and I'm glad we got to do it. I look forward to doing some more with you, absolutely. But I would like to actually strongly recommend that you never attempt this kind of low altitude turn back, even with an actual engine failure, unless you've practiced it, you've become proficient at it, and you're comfortable with it and feel competent at it. And finally, I think it's important to understand that we're not recommending that you do this as a practice that anybody should turn back anytime they lose an engine. It's really only to be accomplished if not doing so would be more hazardous. So if you've got an airport where there's just nowhere to go and it would be more hazardous not to, that's the time we're advocating to do it, but only if you've practiced it, you're comfortable with it, you're proficient with it. And if you're not, and if you're not, and you think that this is not for you, you think there's no way I'm doing that, then don't. Go straight ahead.
Let's pop John back up on the screen one more time before we get out of here. See, he was a very important part of putting this all together. So John, thanks for putting this together. Thanks for being our host. We look forward to doing some more of these, and I hope you'll be taking the helm and taking the wheel and doing it again.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, guys, I really appreciate you letting me be a part of this. And on behalf of the flight instructor community and NAFI members as a whole, I really want to say we appreciate that you guys have gone through the effort to put something like this together. It's really important that pilots in general understand this information, but in my opinion, it's even more important that flight instructors do, because let's remember, flight instructors affect every pilot out there, because every pilot needs a flight review at some point, and every soon-to-be pilot needs a flight instructor. So at one point or another, this kind of information will be passed on from instructors who have watched this video, and I think that the impact in that cannot be measured. So once again, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you, John.
Okay, guys, see you soon.